Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Northwest Managers of Educational Technology. It's exciting to be here. I'm Amy McLaughlin, and my role here at Oregon State University is as the Executive Director of Technical and Solutions Architecture. It's a beautifully long title. What it really means is that I oversee IT operations for OSU, including our academic technologies team, network infrastructure, and our administrative tech team that runs our banner and our student information systems, amongst other things. And with me today are...
Hi, I'm Mike Akey. I work for UIT Infrastructure under Amy.
And I am Carolyn Rothwell. I am an organizational change manager for UIT Business Architecture, which I was not in the role at the time of this project, but I think this project helped us understand that that was a role we needed.
So today we're going to talk about our amazing adventure moving from Google Mail to Office 365 and really consolidating our students onto the same productivity platform as our faculty. So we started this project. Oops, there we go. Do I have a... Okay. Technical challenges. There's this magic button that I should have clicked. There we go. Okay, this should work now. I love technology. Let's try that again. Haha. There we go. Okay, so we started this project with some clear definition of where we were going. So here's where we started. We had students in Gmail and faculty and staff in Office 365. Or so I thought. And then we had a directive that was to move everyone into Office 365 for a couple reasons. One is that there were some security challenges for our students. They were getting, they did not have the same protections in our Google environment that our staff and faculty had in Office 365. So we had a lot of incidents of fraud. We didn't have the control over spam that we do in Office 365. And also so that the student experience would be more cohesive with the faculty staff experience, and then for those people who live in both roles, they would have one thing instead of two. So really to simplify the environment. It seems really simple, right? We're gonna go from there to there. But then comes along the challenge of prioritization and other things that come up, budgets and contracts that we needed to think about and how that would impact us, some unexpected cleanup, and of course, some communications challenges. So our path looked more like that. So, there's always the gap between what you think you're gonna do and what you do, but we still got there, so we're gonna talk about that. So let's talk a bit about setting the stage here. So our goal was unification, simplification, and protection. Maybe not in that order. We had severe cybersecurity challenges impacting our students, and we wanted to get everybody onto one platform where we could offer the best protection and the best student experience. So we started, yeah, like this one? Okay, so we started with some organizational coordination. So there's two components about email. One is when we issue an email address when somebody accepts their arrival at OSU and says they're coming. And the other is the students that already have an email address and have an email and are used to using Google. So there was some organizational coordination that had to happen at top level. First of all, we had direction from our CIO, so that was all on board. And then I met with the Dean of Students, the head of enrollment services, and the registrar, because every single one of those groups was impacted by the transition of the student experience, right? Enrollment services cares about how the email is applied up front and when that change was going to happen. And everybody else cares about how it impacts students who are already here and how that would happen. By the way, the picture that you see is not my original artwork. This was created by a student at OSU when they did a story in our newspaper about the transition. And that was the illustration that they used, so I kind of was entertained by that. So our first thing was to deal with new students because they're the easiest because they don't have an email address and we want to stop giving out Google email and start them in Office 365. So we knew we wanted to have them actually in Office 365 in the fall of 2023. So emails start getting handed out November 1 of 2022 for incoming students for fall of 23. So we negotiated that we would make the change happen for November 1st of 2022, and that we would be ready for incoming students. Now, there's a couple caveats to this, is that we cut over creation of a new email for all new students on November 1 of 2022, which meant if you are a late or like applicant and arrival for winter or spring term of 2023, you actually were in Office 365 from the get-go. So there was a little bit of a gap space where we had some students who were new, but they were earlier than all the other new students, but that was okay. And then we started looking at how we migrate all the rest of the students and what that would look like. And that's a negotiation really with the registrar's office and the dean of students to make sure that that's as smooth as experience as possible and that our campus partners are on board. So we looked at migrating in waves, and we started those waves after spring term and after commencement, because pretty much before commencement, nothing gets done. I mean, there's a couple week gap where we just need to make sure that we're focused on helping people get out the door. And technologically, in terms of supporting OSU, in part that's because OSU is one of 2 universities in the country that hands you your diploma on the day that you graduate. So there's a technical and administrative lift to make that happen. So we completed it over the summer. Mike is going to talk about the actual waves and how those went. But the challenge of making the new student process was actually kind of funny, because what I heard initially was this is going to be a huge amount of work and it's so difficult. And what it turned out to be was about 5 lines of code change. So the actual technical cutover was very simple. We just all had to be on the same page and know when we were going to do it and what it was going to look like, and then to test it. That was the easy part. And then we set up our transition timelines essentially based on OSU's summer term schedule. So students leave or graduate at the middle of June. First group goes then. And then we have 6 different summer sessions at OSU of different varying lengths. And so we timed our waves based on when students finish their summer enrollment. Again, a gap here from a process point is that we had to set a cutoff date that said if you signed up for summer term after this date, you're still migrating at the end of June, because there were so many people we couldn't handle the one-offs. So people who registered after a certain date for summer term, yeah, they were still stuck in the first bucket. So I'm going to hand it off to Mike to talk about how we actually accomplished all of this. And here you go.
Okie dokie. Is this? I don't know what's going to be better. Try this. I'm not sure if it's actually going to pick up my voice as well. I'm just going to hold this. Easily distracted. Again, I'm Mike Akey. I work for UIT Infrastructure. I'm going to talk a bit about developing our unification process, and this can be mildly technical, but not too in-depth. And first part of developing a unification process, make sure you get the right people in the room talking together. And of course, that'd be UIT Infrastructure. That's my group that we handle email for all of the university. And since this is about moving email and calendar, that's pretty important. We also started out with an implementation partner. This would be a third-party contractor, try to help us develop that process and potentially even actually execute the entire migration at the end, although we didn't end up using them for that. A little bit on that later. And of course, identity and access management. They handle user accounts, and of course, they create the new mailboxes for new users. So that's pretty important. And the service desk, they help our users, they support them, they have documentation, they update the documentation for users, and they need to be involved as well. So, and a little bit about OSU's email. We have a hybrid exchange on-prem online situation. right now, all our mailboxes are now in Exchange Online. Hybrid is kind of just a leftover from the past that we'll eventually get away from, but all mailboxes are in online. But the source of truth is on premises. And we also obviously have Google Workspace. Every user has a Google account now. In November 2022, as you heard, they stopped getting Google mailboxes, but they still had a Google account. So, and faculty staff use Exchange Online sort of, as Amy kind of alluded to. Not everybody has to at this point, but or at that point when we were planning this, but most did. And faculty, staff, and students all have the same common mail domain of OregonState.edu. Students have a different domain. I know some institutions have it that way. And all mail flows through Exchange Online. So instead of mail for Google going directly to Google, it goes through Exchange. So it gives us a slight advantage. And I'll talk about that here real quick. So how that works is basically in Exchange, people that don't have an Exchange mailbox, they have a mail user object that has their alias and then an external address with a domain that's hidden from most people called gmx.oregonstate, and that routes it to Google. So this is helpful later on because then we do a conversion of this and the mail just goes to their mailbox instead in Exchange and doesn't go on to Google. So first off, we met up with our implementation partner and identity and access management. This was early in 2023. As stated before, the first wave that we're going to do is in June 2023, so it's a few months out. And some key takeaways from that, we learned that the process is very similar to one we've done before with this Exchange to Exchange Online migration. Microsoft had, in the interim from when we had done the Exchange to Exchange Online migration, had also come up with a process that was very more integrated native to Google, so using Google's APIs, so you don't have to do an IMAP migration, which could have other problems. And also meeting with IAM, they had existing PowerShell code to automate a lot of all of setting up new mailboxes for new users. And since we had people in Google, they're coming to Exchange, we want their mailboxes and their setup in Exchange to be just like a new user. So everything's kind of all in line. And they also provided some information about how we make sure they get licensed properly and updating some directory information so Service Desk knows where their user's mail is. So when they call in and say, I can't log into Google, they know, hey, it's in Exchange now. So then from then we did some early testing. So we set up the integration with Microsoft instructions to connect to Google and do some test migrations. This time we're developing PowerShell scripts of our own to kind of automate the process since we're going to be doing this a few times over. And we try to determine some issues with like what is or isn't going to be migrated because Microsoft isn't necessarily forthcoming about certain aspects of that. Like what calendar items are going to move. We saw some issues with certain time series aren't compatible with Outlook. Labels, in Google they have something called labels instead of folders, and how is that going to migrate over? And generally it goes into folders that the migration creates folders, puts them in there. There may be some duplication if something has multiple labels, and so stuff like that Microsoft didn't really define it very well. It just said, stuff's going to move. Oh, sorry. I don't know if that was me, but and then so we did the initial test migrations of some students we had, and they went really well. There was no problems. In fact, we had no complaints. They're just like, oh, yeah, I'm using Outlook now. So that wasn't. We were hoping for a little more out of that than just it just worked. But that was also really great because it just worked. So and throughout this, I may have already said migration to unification. In this context, it's the same thing. I called it a migration because the terminology that Microsoft uses. But so a little bit about our timeline here. We migrated students in 3 waves, as Amy has already said, and that was strictly defined by the Office of the Registrar. They gave us, here's the list, 1, 2, 3. You get to move these people then and only then. And so they're moving at the end of the term. The first wave, I already mentioned that, but the important part is that we get 1 week for each wave to complete. So in that time period, it has to be moved over and done. And we also had a fourth wave. I don't think that was on the previous slide. That is kind of a makeup wave, but it also was all the rest of the faculty and staff. So we were very focused on students in the beginning, but faculty and staff, as I mentioned, they still had the option to use Google. So we still need to get them out of there because it's unification. We're out of Google. That's the end goal here. So just some idea of how many people are moving. We're kind of front loaded here with 29,000 people because they're students. These are all students in the first wave. And it's right after spring term, so most people aren't going to come here during the summer. And then we had a mid-wave in the summer. That's wave 2, wave 3 at the end, and wave 4 is kind of big because that's where we put in all faculty staff at the end. So, and here's briefly, and I'll go into some more detail about these, but these are the basic unification steps. First, we give a big list of users. We give them to Exchange online. We put them in programmatically, and we segment them into different batches. We don't want to do them all at once. It's just how the process works. Then we wait for synchronization. Microsoft does its thing, reaches out to Google. We want it to reach 95%, and then Microsoft's going to hold there until we say, hey, go complete. And that's what we do at the end, and we go and poke it with a stick a bunch of times because it's going to complain about skipped items and other things that it wants you to worry about, but we just want it to complete. But the end process it can take some babysitting. And so that first part, migration batch sizing, we weren't really sure how many people to put in a batch at a time, how many people are going to move in a group. And at this point, our implementation partner, we had already had some issues with them, and we asked them about that. What about other migrations you've done in the past? And they're not something wasn't clicking there, and they weren't giving us an answer. Oh yeah, we did 500 people, and and they worked this number of days or this amount of data, and so that was kind of the last straw with them. And we also reached out to Microsoft support, and they're like, oh yeah, and I threw out some numbers to them, and they're like, oh yeah, you could do that, or a little smaller, it'll be fine. Like, okay, that's not helpful. Anyway, so we ended up going nuts on it. Since the first migration that we'd done testing, a few hundred people, went really well, we decided, well, we're going to start with 1,000 on the first day in this 1 week window. We started out with 1,000, and we sat there for a few hours watching. Got provisioned. It was working great. So then we just loaded the rest in large 4,000 person batches. And I'm here to say, yeah, that worked, but don't do that. It's working with batches that size and the PowerShell and commands and stuff like that just take an exorbitant amount of time. So really, the next few waves, we learned a lesson. Although it worked, we got done in the 1 week period. We reduced our batch size by quite a bit. And smaller batch sizes also reduced some very strange transient errors that came up that stopped the process, that you had to go in and restart migrations for different users for various errors. And when you have less of them, it seemed to reduce those errors. I don't know why, but here we are. And the next part, of course, reaching 95% synced. So something important to note here is that users have 2 mailboxes at this point. They have the Exchange mailbox and they have Google. And so what happens is, when that previous step, we provisioned a mailbox for them in Exchange, and then we set forwarding on it, so the mail goes to Google. And so it's very important that user understands that the mail not be synchronized yet in their Exchange mailbox. So in our case, we told them we're cutting over on this date at the end of the week, and not go in there and see, oh, well, something's not there. Well, it's not done yet. So, and in wave 1, we were thinking about how long, we were concerned about this in the beginning, how long was this going to take? We're going to meet the 1 week window, and it took about 2 days to get to the 95% synchronization. That was, 10, 15 terabytes of mail, whatever. And it turned out to be okay. And of course, I see here time to check for forwarding, because there are certain cases where users have a mailbox left over for whatever reason. They were a student employee, they went back and they're still a student, but we took away their Exchange mailbox in the past, and it comes back, and the migration process says, I'm not going to touch that. I'm not going to touch forwarding because that's already here. That's, I'm not provisioning a new one. So, and if you break forwarding because we're in line to Google, and we told them that their mail's in Google until the end of the week, and the forwarding isn't there, then their mail doesn't go to Google, and they don't get their mail, and they're like, what's going on? So, and we'll go on to the final part here of the process, is completing everything. Obviously, we tell Exchange to do the completion process. You can set a completion date in advance. We didn't. I guess we weren't confident about that in the beginning. We wanted to have more control over it, but in reality, you can set a completion date, but it's still going to say, hey, you got a bunch of skipped items for these various, sundry users, and skipped items. You're not going to be able to go in and say, oh, fix this and move it. It's just hey, something's broken. I'm trying to tell you about it, so and we can make a note of it. But in any case, this is where you have to go back and say, just approve skipped items, and it goes through, if you have a batch of 4,000, it's only going through so many, and it tries to synchronize that last 5%, and then it finds more items that it's not able to migrate, so you have to go back and do that approval process over and over again. So that's where the part where I'm saying you got to poke it with a stick, because it's like, do something. So, and the completion process, it takes about 24 hours. In our first wave, we had a long tail of about 3 extra days where we had like 2 users that, for some reason, you look at the detailed logs and it says it's, stuck in some sort of timeout situation, and there's some counter that we had no control over. So 3 days later, on Monday, next week, that person was migrated, completed, and done. So. And there's some specific stuff to our process in OSU, except the first thing on this slide, of course, is that we have to add a forwarding address. We didn't actually use this because of our mail configuration. And then after batch creation, we did some special stuff, which is we had to convert the on-prem mail users to remote mailboxes to kind of synchronize things from our on-prem, which is still the authoritative information source for online in that hybrid configuration. Disable default address policy, that gives them the first not last. We don't give those to students. It synchronized some good unique identifiers, and then of course check forwards on those provisioned mailboxes and make sure they're licensed. You get 30 days to license them, so it's not a big hurry, but just get it done while we're there. And then when we're after complete, we'll enable the online archive. You don't want to do this in advance, especially if you have a default policy, because if the archive or some sort of mailbox rule starts deleting or taking away messages, the migration process notices that and says, hey, I migrated this, but it disappeared. What happened? So we did that after the completion. Then, and that day that we said we're cutting things off, we do just that. We take away their access to the Google Mail and calendar applications. Now, we still use Google for other things at the moment, and they still have a Google account, but we take away the mail and calendar applications. So as a part of this project, it's strictly about mail and calendar stuff. So, but they can still access other Google things. And then there was that I mentioned earlier, telling the service desk to make sure they have the updated information where a person's mailbox is, so when they come in, in between a wave, they know how to support that user. And some results, over 56,000 mailboxes were moved over the 2023. We only had about 3 users that really needed to be migrated. I say needed, they asked for it and were very pushy, but 3 users out of 56,000, we'll do it again for you. This stems from an issue of some people actually had mailbox rules that they had an existing mailbox. This is a faculty staff issue where some of them were using Google exclusively but had rules in their Exchange mailbox because they had one, but they never touched it, that went and delete messages or didn't delete messages, and all their mail for the past 10, 5-10 years is in there unread, mixed in with all their other mail. So you could see why they would complain. So we were able to mitigate some of that. But so yeah, majority was completed just before Christmas. And I said there were a couple of users in late February. They said they're done, we're good. We cut off their access, and now there's no more mail flow to Google. And so to me, that's a success. We have one less mail platform. And just talk a little bit about some technical challenges. So like I said before, test pool users, real small. Ideally, we probably would have had a more diverse set of users, not just ones that were technically savvy from our service desk, and maybe some more faculty users to see some of the more strange situations that we came up with later in migration waves. Yeah, and like I said, there was those mailbox rules that we found in the fourth wave. Of course, all the way at the end, we're like, well, we got this made, and then run into some strange issues in December. So, and another thing that we didn't think about, name changes. People change their name. They get for whatever reason, and that changes their username. And when your username changes, the process doesn't know what to do with your, when in mid-migration, it's like, well, this user account doesn't exist anymore, so you got to start them over. And that's an arduous process because you can't edit those migration batches other than to remove users. You can't add ones back, so you have to create a whole new migration batch and start the process again. Yeah, and I talked about the special situation with certain faculty staff. The service desk, we had some information, we wanted to tell them where the mailbox is. That was not an automated process. If we do this again, I would definitely make sure that was. So there was some timing delays from when we updated information. The service desk was like, well, wait a minute, is their mail really in Google or not? So we caused some grief for them for a little bit, unfortunately, but we were able to fix that later on. And ungoogleable error messages, that was, I mentioned earlier, like, why is this process stopped? And you see, this gives you this error message that, why did this user fail to migrate? It says it failed to migrate, but it's really just Google was probably busy, or you're doing 4,000 users at once. What? So, and so with the result of that is just restart the user's migration, and it works. So, and lingering mailboxes I mentioned. If they had a mailbox before, that can cause some issues. So, anyway, that's enough out of me. It's time for Carolyn to talk about managing change.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, Mike gets all the credit here. It's a very good job on the technical side of the migration. So I was brought in to manage the change. So how are we going to communicate this to our students that we will be making this transition? So, of course, as Amy spoke to and Mike spoke to, it started with engaging the right stakeholders. So Amy met with the key stakeholders early and often to have that unified support with the Dean of Students, Admissions, Office of the Registrar, and Faculty Senate. So we had those key players in place and supporting this process. And as Mike mentioned, this required a lot of coordination between different groups within OSU IT. And as Amy talked about priorities, everybody has different priorities. So it was really key to get everybody on the same page and bring them together for this. Okay, that did not. Oh, it did move the slide. Okay, so talking about the students. So to engage and communicate this change, we really framed the messaging around the benefits that students should receive from moving from Google and Gmail to Microsoft 365. And as Amy mentioned, the first was really the driver of the change, which was security. So students, of course, this was a benefit that they understood because they were getting phished and they were getting these emails. And, we had seen, unfortunately, students negatively impacted by that. The second item was, as Amy mentioned, collaboration and calendaring. So that was going to be having everybody on one platform, faculty, staff, students. So we didn't have to worry about that collaboration barrier between using different platforms. And I was talking to some different professors and faculty members, and they did find that was a barrier. You know, they didn't have a shared calendaring system when they're working with student employees or grad students, so they were really looking forward to that change, at least on the professional faculty side of things. Okay, I can't scroll on my notes here, Amy. Oh, it's not a touch screen.
It is not a touch screen.
Oh, there we go. Not a touch screen. I'm so spoiled by touch screens. So bad. The third of which was mail delivery. So we were seeing some issues with mail delivery between the platforms. So I was talking to an academic advisor, and they used Bookings, Microsoft Bookings at the time, for their advising appointments, and they were finding those appointments go and land in students' junk. So it was causing a barrier there. I was also talking to a student event coordinator, and same thing, they would send an Outlook calendar invite to their students and it would just land in their spam. It didn't work very well. So that was a benefit of this. And then last but not least, of course, which I don't think students really understood at the time, but moving them into Microsoft 365 for their email also just moved them into that platform, right? So they have all those productivity tools available, easy access to them, so kind of move them right into the front door of the modern tools that Microsoft is offering and that we're really trying to leverage here at OSU. So one other thing we did was create a website. Currently, most of these items were moving towards internal documentation and a SharePoint site, but at the time we did not have that, so it's just a public website on our OSU web presence here. And we also use the easy to remember short links so that you can see their beeves/email. So this was easy to remember, easy to direct people to, and it acted as a quick place we could reference people and we could keep updated information up there. So we had information to answer and get ahead of their questions like, will my email address change? Will I miss my messages? Can I opt out and still use Gmail? Which of course was no. And also, is Google going away? Do I have to move everything off of Google Drive? So it was a really great place just to get ahead of those questions without needing to, write a book to our students and email. Okay, so what did students think when they first heard that their email was going away from Gmail to Microsoft 365? Amy had the great graphic that was included in the student newspaper. This is some Reddit post, right? So it was kind of good to hear the student sentiment. One of which says, I love how the email said, we are excited to go to Microsoft. I wonder how much money Microsoft paid them or how much cheaper Microsoft was. Nobody born after 1970s has been excited about Outlook. So unfortunately, Microsoft didn't pay us. We actually paid them a lot of money, and Gmail is free. So that was not exactly true, but good to hear this messaging. The second one, valuable benefits, like, LOL, maybe the cybersecurity argument, everything else just seems like a net negative. So it was really actually great and refreshing to have this feedback in this public forum, because it's not necessarily things that students might say to your face if you were to go talk to them about it. They might say, we're not excited or we don't want to. So it's really good to hear that. And we did adjust our messaging. We'd probably use a different word besides we're excited to move to Microsoft 365. But something that we did really lean into is the cybersecurity aspect for the messaging, because that was something that resonated most with the students, and they really understood the impact there. So to communicate the change, we knew that reaching students was a challenge, right? So email, we can't necessarily expect students to read all their emails. We knew that alone wasn't going to cut it. So we did target the appropriate communication channels, and we use those to share that key messaging and where they can get resources. And of course, the advantage of being campus is that we have students here. So where students live. So students that lived in the dorms, we had posters up, and they have a Beaver movie streaming service, so we were able to add ads to that, which was cool. Where students eat, so where they eat on campus, we had posters and digital signage up. Where they study, we had information tables, flyers, and stickers at things like the library. Where they access their services, so things like there's a media hub center for students and the service desk walk up where they can get help. We had the same kind of information sources, so they could grab a cute little sticker sheet there, which students love, we found. And on the back was just an information sheet about the move and when they would be moving and the details with the website. And then also where students learn. So we have, at this time it was a brand new student portal called Beaver Hub, so we were able to put messaging out on that with more information. And then also ended up putting messaging on our learning management system, Canvas, which we typically don't do. It's typically out of scope for Canvas, but because there were we knew a lot of students didn't read the email that their email was moving, we really wanted to get that messaging ahead of them, and Amy got the go-ahead to put that messaging up there. Okay, so talking about email, we always said students don't read their email, right? We can't rely on that, but we didn't necessarily have metrics around it. So in this case, we used Salesforce Marketing Cloud for the email messaging. So it was really nice because we were able to actually get some of the metrics. As you can see here, that first migration, so it was a lot of students. It was 29,000, a big chunk of the total 56,000 that were going. And you can see here, this was the first email sent to that first wave. So they had a 52.8% open rate. So that meant that about 15,000 students at least maybe saw the message, they opened it, they interacted with it in some way. So that's great. But we did worry about the impact for all those other students, right? The 14,000 other students that didn't look at this message at all. And how was that going to impact our support services like the service desk? And of course, the students. So I will say we did see better engagement with our messaging later on, and those would be typically because those students were on campus actively enrolled in summer sessions, so they're more likely to be reading and checking their messaging. Another thing I'll say is that the Office of the Registrar keeps track of all the emails sent to students, so we can't just be spamming students and sending them, reminder message every day about this. So we really had to limit our messaging. But some of the metrics around this were really helpful, so we were able to limit reminders that were sent to people that had opened the messages, but then add more messages to those that hadn't opened a previous message. So let's talk about the service desk. How did they fare? So they didn't get 14,000 calls from that first wave, so that was good. We ended up with about 1,000 tickets at the service desk, so not insignificant, right? Like the service desk is built to surge and be flexible and handle this kind of load, but it was impactful. And that start of fall term, so the 29,000 students, well, they really had all moved before the start of fall term, minus the last migration wave that Mike talked about in December. So they had all moved. It was the busiest start that we had ever had to a fall term. And, a lot of those are probably due to questions like this, but overall the questions were really simple. So it was all things that the service desk was prepared for. They had, of course, a knowledge base and then internal FAQs that they had accumulated and added to over time. So one of the number one questions we got was just students trying to get to their Gmail. And they would just get the message, we're sorry, you do not have access to Gmail. Please contact your organization administrator for access. So that was just the generic messaging from Gmail when they were cut off from Gmail access. Unfortunately, it wasn't something where we could tailor the messaging or add any customization. That would have been super helpful, but we didn't have that ability. So I think a lot of those just amounted to people talking to a friend or calling the service desk and being like, hey, what's up? I can't get to my Gmail. And then we just had automated messages that the service desk could send out and let them know, like, this is where you check your email now and the steps with that. And I will give out a shout out to Mike and team. There were some more complicated technical issues, and Mike and his team continued to test and work to answer those questions. So the service desk had a lot of support in supporting our users throughout this. Okay, this isn't on the slides, but Mike talked a little bit about the faculty and staff side, which was, and Amy too, was a little bit of a surprise. We knew that most of the faculty and staff had moved to Exchange Online already, and now the students had moved, but the faculty and staff, we didn't really realize that they had the opportunity to opt out of prior migrations. And they were a little bit harder to manage as far as managing the change, because it wasn't like a directive coming from the top leadership that, yeah, all students are going, right? This is something faculty and staff, they've been able to elect and opt out, and they were using Gmail for a reason. So we had to be a little bit more careful with how we managed the change for that group. One of the things that we did was kind of soften the messaging by allowing them to opt in to waves. So if they wanted to move over Thanksgiving instead of Christmas, we allowed them to opt in. And we did get some early adopters, and that kind of helped people understand the change was coming. There wasn't going to be an option to opt out, but be a little bit flexible. It's like you have some control over when your email moves. We did find things like people having grant funding, things like that, tied to a project that they were using a Google Calendar. And like Mike alluded to, we had to make some exceptions. So we were really just flexible with those and make exceptions to the point that they were able to successfully transition as needed before we cut off their access. So I think we had a good mix of firmness that you're moving and flexibility to just make sure it wasn't going to ruin anybody's grant funding or project or anything like that. So that's it for managing change, and I'll pass it back to Amy to wrap us up here.
Okay, so actually, this is our chance for you to ask questions. We had it was an adventure. There were a lot of things we didn't know going into it that we assumed that we did not realize that people had been given an option to choose which email platform they were using in the faculty and staff side. So that was an excitement. By the way, if you are making a mail migration, I strongly suggest you don't give people a choice about which mail system they're going to use. That's not going to serve you well in the long run. So anyways, but it was very successful. It does take a collaborative effort across teams, and really working not just in the technology zone, but with all our partners across campus and across the university to make that happen. So yeah, open it up for questions for whoever. Yes, Marjorie.
What was that volume of?
I'm going to come over with the mic so that people who are hearing the recording later can hear the question.
Thank you. What was the total, and an estimate is fair, that were the faculty staff that had opted to continue to use Google? What was the volume?
You know? Probably, I thought it was a little higher, but between 200 and 400, probably. And some super fun side notes on that. A couple of them had, they had an Outlook mailbox, and then they had forwarded everything from the Outlook back. So when we migrated, all their stuff went over to Outlook and went into deleted and tried to forward back. So we didn't know about that rule either at the time.
Just for curiosity, what was your IDM product that you're using for the student ingestion into your like Banner or Workday that you're using? Because this is something we're considering doing, is moving away from Google entirely, being we are an A3 school. And so that's one of the biggest questions right now is first we need to get our IDM working, but I'm just curious.
I think that's a Mike question. Do you know? It might be a Marjorie question.
Actually, that's
Yeah. Marjorie works with the identity people, so.
So we, at the time, were not moving our identity source yet. So it was a homegrown situation where we had a bunch of scripts that had kind of been I don't know, nice way to put it, but there were Perl scripts. It was a series of things. Those most of those have been retired now. So if you fast forward through this was when we started our actual replacement of our identity system, which went live last June. So at the time, the source, it all stems from a space in Banner. There's a particular table that serves as the beginning of all accounts, and that's still true now as we're transitioning over the next few years, because we're starting another project to replace Banner. And so there's going to be where it comes from will change over time. But even right now, that serves as the source. We're using Savient. We moved to Savient as our product, as our identity source. That went live last June.
Thanks, Marjorie. Oh,
I'm kind of salivating that your students and your faculty are on the same email domain. Was it always that way? And for an institution like ours, where we have students on a separate domain and faculty on the same domain, do you have any words of wisdom as to the benefits or reasons as to why everybody's on the same domain that could help us maybe decide whether or not that's an avenue for us to take for mail down the road?
anybody want to take that? I have an opinion, but
I think it might work better. But, I mean, so what we didn't talk about here. So we have something called Own It accounts for every user. And in the past, I think faculty staff would get the Oregon State, the Glengarry leads or whatever, the nice email address, Oregon State, but they had ownit.oregon state and ownit.orst, and everybody had that, faculty, staff, students, volunteers, associates. And Oregon State was really, .edu was for people that had exchange, and that was only faculty, staff, and those who even paid for it, and there's a whole history there too. And that all changed, and then I don't know at what point someone decided everybody gets Oregon. We're trying to unify our branding, I suppose, OregonState.edu, but people still had ownit.org and Oregon State. But I'll let you go with your
opinion. Okay, I have an actual opinion from sort of my. I am faculty at a community college as well, part time, and in that other organization, I have a faculty account, and then my students are in a different space, and it can be really difficult to collaborate. And I think that one of the key things that we have here experientially is that the barriers to collaboration are collapsed when everybody is together. The other challenge that we have here, if we don't have people together, is that we have role confusion. So we have graduate students who are also graduate teaching personnel or paid research personnel, and so they are employees and they are students, and they need to be one person, not bifurcated or chopped into pieces in a system. So we've really done a lot of work to sort of get away from having this am I a employee or am I a student question for just a unified experience. And that's not just in the email realm, but we used to have a student media services and a faculty media services, and we had people who would stand between the two buildings going, which one do I go to? And we just now have Media Hub for exactly the same reason. So that's my opinion. All right, any other questions?
I was going to add to that because Amy talked about the cybersecurity benefits of the one platform, and that's been huge, just from our ability to continue to increase what we were offering of protection to the students, because what we could do in the 365 space proactively to make sure that spam wasn't getting into and now it's aggressive. We do have to do some tweaking on that because it is super aggressive, but the benefits to the students outweighed even that, minimized if things inadvertently end up in spam or get filtered. The other thing is we can proactively go clean things up if they're identified. If they make it through and they land in people's inboxes and people are reporting it, we can go proactively clean that up as well, so that it's not even an issue for the students and staff.
Yeah, well. Yeah, I'll get to that too. Tim.
I just have more of a comment for you, because I came from the community college system where that was a very common thing. But one of the exercises we did to kind of determine what we need to do was we did a student journey exercise. So I was lucky enough to work with a lot of people who are very visual. So we literally went into a room and we mapped out what was the current experience for students in this kind of bi-domain world, right? And we kind of marked all the touch points, and then we literally slapped these red frown faces on those points that were kind of bad, right? And so we did that for the current two-tiered system, or whatever you want to call it. Then we did it again for what we envision what the new one-domain system looked like. So you could literally see there's a lot less red on the other side, right? So that was what was helpful, though. That really brought the non-technical people to the table and allowed them to understand why something like this is really important. For community colleges, enrollment and retention is huge. And if we can remove those barriers, then that's how we did it. So that's kind of the way we approached it, and it seemed to be really effective. Yeah.
Thanks, Tim. And just for a side note, Tim is the director of IT at the College of Agricultural Sciences here.
So you said you've moved all the emails from Google over, well, we're Google School. So my question is, how are you planning on moving all your Google Drives, all your Google Access? Are you moving it to SharePoint? Are you moving it to OneDrive? What is your plans for that?
That is a very good question. So a little bit of context, and Carolyn said this earlier, which is that we were on the free version of Google. And part of the reason that we moved everybody to Microsoft isn't because Google's good, bad, or otherwise, is because we were in the paid version of Microsoft. And in the paid version of whatever tool you use, you get the security controls that you do not get in a free. I mean, it's, you get what you pay for, really, regardless of which vendor. That's not a vendor diss at all. It's just a statement. If we wanted that in Google, we could pay for it. So to your question, well, we're still working on that plan. And here's why. We have a decent amount of stuff in Google storage in Drive, and some of it is research sharing, public, or not public facing, but facing out to other colleges and universities. So what we did for the near term is we basically said we put caps on how much data you could have in Google. And those people who are our high users, we set their cap high, but they'll get alerts if they start pumping a ton of extra data in there. And we just paid by the terabyte for the additional storage, which was significantly less expensive than having two platforms in operation at the full platform cost.
You haven't thought about doing a Microsoft file servers internally?
We're looking at lots of different things, but we have a lot of projects in flight right now. So sometimes because it's really the organizational change piece of finding all the individuals who have this need in their, or are using it for their research, which is predominantly where the big lift is, and helping them move is very, is not a small endeavor because it's fairly labor intensive. So it's just a matter of where that falls in the overall schedule of things. What we are doing is a move forward stand of, hey, you're going to go do research. Here are your choices. And really steering people away from Google so that we start to see eventually the drop off. We won't be adding to it.